Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to our Bible as History series. The purpose of these videos is to sort of give some reflection and give a bit of thought into the fact that the Bible was written in history. We can point to historical events and to see if the archaeology and the historical background can help us as one of the many ways that can help us in our faith. As you've seen from the last video, sometimes we've been talking about historical moments, certain events or certain places, as well as some biblical characters. And we're going to carry on looking at certain biblical characters. And the one we're going to look at today is Jonah. And we're going to be sharing some questions about this man and what we can learn from him about the biblical account. So welcome, everyone. We're going to kick off with our first question, which is basically, Phil, who was Jonah and why was he important?
Well, Jonah was an Old Testament prophet in Israel. And according to the Old Testament, Jonah was given this commission to go to Nineveh. Nineveh, of course, was the capital of ancient Assyria. And the purpose of that was to tell them that unless they sort of repented from their wickedness, judgment was going to come upon them. And of course, Jonah, as the story unfolds, we read that, of course, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to run away. I don't think he was particularly interested in the Assyrians. Of course, he was hoping that God would destroy them because of that particular hatred for the Assyrians. It also tells us, of course, that Jonah was a prophet during in the reign of a certain Israelite king called Jeroboam II. And that would have been somewhere around 783 BC.
Right. So why is Jonah important when we think about that dating and this particular era? Why is he important, do you think?
Well, I think he's important for quite a few reasons. From a Christian point of view, of course, the story of Jonah does symbolize the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You'll remember in Matthew 12, remember the religious leaders, they came to Jesus asking for a sign. And Jesus responds to that by saying, wicked generation always asks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. And of course, Jesus explains that something greater than Jonah was here. So from a Christian point of view, it's important because it does symbolize Jesus's death and resurrection. Another reason, perhaps, I believe the story of Jonah is important maybe from an historical standpoint. After Jonah preached in Nineveh, there was this overwhelming response. You'll remember in the story that even the king himself, it says he was clothed in sackcloth and ashes. And when you read that, of course, that's an outward sign of repentance. So some theologians have come up with what they call the Jonah effect. And let me just give you an example. For many years, there was always wars between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, as well as other campaigns by the Assyrian Empire. So there was always this constant worry of wars right across all the neighboring countries, and mainly with bloodshed and extreme cruelty. Most historians now recognize that Assyria was probably the most cruel and vicious nation within the ancient world. And they were well known for impaling their prisoners and victims on stakes. So they were a very, very cruel nation. And this was probably why Jonah probably hated them. And he was hoping that God, of course, would destroy them. So I would say that perhaps this was probably the very reason why he didn't want to go there. But what I find fascinating about this of Jonah's preaching, which incidentally, God gave him a second chance. And but during that 40 years from 480 to about 440, there seemed to have been a time of peace and prosperity. And that's why theologians have called it the Jonah effect. There was peace between Jeroboam, who was the king of Israel, and Uzziah, who was the king of Judah, both of whom reigned for 40 years. We now know from archaeological evidence that at this time it was considered to be the most prosperous time that both Judah and Israel had known. And this prosperity, of course, was probably built on trade, on friendship, which would have benefited, of course, everybody, even their natural enemy, the Assyrians. And what's even more fascinating, we don't even have any cuneiform texts that suggests that Assyria was in their doing their campaigns in the neighboring countries. Let me just mention the famous archaeologist Austin Henry Layard. When he first discovered the library at Nineveh in 1846, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of these cuneiform texts. And what was popular by Assyrian kings up to that time was how much land they always invaded, how many people they killed. You would always read that. A great king had a certain amount of people killed. But now, during this time from 780 to 740, there was this relative quiet in the text regarding the kings of that period. The Assyrian texts, of course, tell us that one particular king was Shalmaneser IV, who reigned between somewhere 782 to about 773 BC. He was a very weak king, and he was very much disliked by the nobility. There were three other kings where very little is said about them because they seemed to have had this peaceful reign. One particular king, whose name was Adad-Nirari, who reigned from 754 to about 745, the records actually tells us that he rarely ever left his palace. So I believe that the Jonah effect must have been very, very effective. That's what makes, I think, Jonah to be a very important prophet of that time.
Mm. And so is the story in and of itself, is that true or is it a metaphor, do you think?
I assume you mean the story of Jonah being swallowed by a whale?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think Jesus, for a start, ever saw it as a metaphor. He didn't see it as a moral story because he used it, obviously, to symbolize his death and resurrection. But I think he obviously saw Jonah and the story attached to Jonah as being an historical event. He was an historical person that was just engulfed by this enormous fish. I suppose you could ask the question, has there ever been anyone else that have ever had such a traumatic experience? Well, the answer to that is yes. There have been certain people that have supposedly been swallowed by whales. One particular chap, not quite so long ago, actually, his name was Michael Packard. And as the story goes, he was diving off Cape Cod. Now, Cape Cod, of course, is located in the state of Massachusetts in America. The place itself is quite interesting. It was well known as being the first transatlantic signal that was sent from there. from America to Great Britain by the famous Italian inventor Marconi. So it has some historical value in that sense, but apparently, and you can actually still read it in the paper, you can probably get clips of this, as he was diving off Cape Cod, apparently, according to the news, he was swallowed by a large whale, and after 30 seconds, he was spat out. Of course, the most famous one, of course, would have been James Bartley, who lived in the 19th century. He died in the early part of the 20th century. Now, he also admitted being swallowed by a sperm whale. And he was found still living days later in the stomach of the whale when the whale was actually harpooned. And that was in the year 1891. So anything is possible, I guess. But these are just some examples. However, I have to say this, I don't think that would, even though it's fantastic to read things like that, and things possibly could happen, I think what it does, though, Dale, it misses the real thrust of the Jonah story to me. You know, to try to look for evidence to see whether it is possible to live after being swallowed by a whale. I think the story itself is all about God and God's justice, God's grace, and God's deliverance. I think if you look at the story, although it's called the Book of Jonah, I think the real character of it has to be God. The whale is not something that comes as a mean animal like you would read in something like Moby Dick. You know, when Captain Ahab was, you know, he had this sort of narcissistic sort of attitude that he wanted to kill the whale. Well, I don't think the whale was seen in that way. I think God actually sent this. It doesn't say whale, it just says a large fish. But I think the large fish represented something that God was bringing deliverance to Jonah, not being cruel, but to deliver him, to save him. And as I say, although the book is all about Jonah, it really should be all about God, because he's the one that brings deliverance. And eventually, of course, not only deliverance for Jonah, but he also brings deliverance from the very people that Jonah didn't want to go to, the Ninevites. So is it true? I believe it is. Was Jonah's message successful? I think it was very successful. And I think there is much, much that we can actually learn for us today from this story.
Oh, thank you very much, Phil. That's really fascinating, and that's some really good stuff for us to think about. For those watching, I will also repost the video that Phil did on Nineveh, which obviously we know is very much connected to the story of Jonah. So if you would like to watch or rewatch that video again, that also will give you some background. But we really hope and pray that this video has given you not only some historical evidence to think about to help us prove the story in time, but also that it has given you some spiritual application that you can apply to your life, whether you're a Christian or not, that you know that God is a reality, he is a just God, and he delivers his people when they follow him and when they obey him. So we really hope and pray that these two aspects of the story will really speak out to you. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us, as well as visiting our website and our YouTube channel with many other videos looking at different topics and many fascinating subjects that you can look at. We thank you so much and have a great afternoon.